Hello, Housing Committee. Today we're going to walk through what a housing needs assessment is, why it's important, and how housing need is typically calculated. As we start to work through the regional housing needs assessment process, it's important that we all have a shared understanding of what these calculations are trying to measure and the type of data that go into them. The goal today isn't to turn everyone into a data analyst. Instead, it's to provide enough background so that we can have informed discussions about housing needs should be measured in our region. This presentation will focus on 5 key questions. First, what exactly is a housing needs assessment? Second, why do communities and regions conduct them? Third, what components are typically included in a needs assessment? Fourth, what is Connecticut requiring under new legislation? And finally, how will our working group approach this process over the coming months? A housing needs assessment is a data-driven way of understanding whether a community, region, or state has enough housing and whether that housing meets the needs of current and future residents. It helps assess what type of housing is needed, for whom, where, and how much. Different states and regions may use different methods, but the overall objectives are generally similar. First, we want to estimate current and future demand. Second, we want to understand how population, demographic, and economic trends may affect housing need. And third, we want to identify groups that may face unique housing challenges, such as lower-income households, older adults, people experiencing homelessness, or others whose needs may not be fully met by the existing housing supply. At its core, a housing needs assessment provides a factual foundation for housing decisions. Rather than relying on assumptions or anecdotes, communities can use data to understand what's actually happening in the housing market. It supports evidence-based policies by helping local leaders identify real housing needs. It also helps communities plan for future growth by identifying potential shortages before they become more severe. And finally, it helps guide investments, whether that's infrastructure, public funding, affordable housing programs, or other initiatives designed to support community goals. While housing decisions are often made locally, housing markets operate regionally. People regularly live in one town, work in another, and access services throughout the region. Housing affordability challenges, migration patterns, and economic trends rarely stop at municipal boundaries. Looking at housing need from a regional perspective gives us a more complete understanding of how these markets function and how communities are connected. A regional assessment can also help municipalities coordinate their efforts and make more efficient use of infrastructure, transportation systems, and public resources. Most housing needs assessments involve 3 major steps. The first is determining need. This is where we estimate how many housing units are needed overall. The second is allocating units. Once need is identified, the question becomes how responsibility should be distributed among municipalities. The third step is accommodation. Communities then examine how they might plan for and accommodate that housing through local policies and planning strategies. Today, we're primarily focused on that first step, determining need. Connecticut is not starting from scratch. Many states across the country have already developed housing needs assessment frameworks. States such as California, Oregon, Washington, and New Hampshire have established methodologies that estimate housing need and translate those needs into planning goals. Organizations like Up for Growth have also developed national methodologies that are frequently referenced as best practices. We analyzed these examples to understand similarities as well as where different approaches produce different results. You should have received a copy of the analysis, which we encourage you to review prior to our next meeting. It's also linked on the slides, which you'll receive a copy of. When housing need is calculated, there are generally 3 major components. The first is current need. This looks at whether today's housing supply adequately serves today's households. In other words, if everyone who needs housing today had access to appropriate housing, how many units would be required? The second component is future need. This estimates the additional housing needed to accommodate future population and household growth. The third component is a target vacancy rate. A healthy housing market needs some level of vacancy. If every unit is occupied, households have very few choices and competition for housing becomes more intense. When we add these three components together, we arrive at an estimate of total housing need. This slide shows some of the data points commonly used to calculate housing need. For current need, we often look at factors such as population, household size, affordability, overcrowding, homelessness, and existing housing stock. For future need, we use population projections and assumptions about future household formation. The key takeaway is that in assessing housing need, we are simply comparing people to units, housing demand and housing supply. But people and units are not simple numbers. We use a collection of data points that either increase or decrease the number of people or the number of units we're comparing until we feel we have a good approximation of need. As a reminder, OPM is also developing housing growth targets that will shape our process. PA 25-1 established several factors that OPM must consider in creating their growth targets. These include household growth, affordable housing availability, demographic changes, housing cost burden, overcrowding, and other indicators of housing need. Importantly, the COGs are expected to base their methodologies on the state's work, but there's still room for regional discussion and refinement. That flexibility is one of the reasons this group plays an important role. We're laying the groundwork for understanding what that refinement might be. This slide compares what we currently understand about Connecticut's approach with methodologies that are commonly considered best practices elsewhere. Note that there's a significant amount of overlap. Many of the data points being considered by the state are also used in housing needs assessments across the country. There are also some differences and nuances that we'll want to evaluate as we develop a methodology that works for our region. It's important to remember that the state's final report has not yet been released, so this comparison is based only on the information that's currently available. The good news is that based on what we know today, OPM's approach generally aligns with national best practices. That doesn't mean every decision is settled. We still need to discuss how different data sources should be used, how various factors should be measured, and which data points will ultimately be incorporated as we work to ensure that the methodology accurately reflects housing condition within our region. Our next major milestone will be the August workshop, where we'll take a deeper dive into the data and explore options for calculating housing need. Between now and then, we encourage you to review the background materials we've provided, familiarize yourself with the state's efforts, and begin discussions with your local working groups. Over the coming months, we'll review best practices, evaluate methodologies, test different approaches, and gather feedback. Our goal is to reach a shared understanding of how housing needs should be measured so that the resulting analysis is transparent, data-driven, and useful to municipalities across the region.